noon, 6, and midnight Eastern. We also have live coverage of book festivals around the country. Today, Book TV is live at the Virginia Festival of the Book, and we're bringing you a special simulcast of C-SPAN 2's Book TV here on C-SPAN. This live panel discussion on the popularity of memoirs includes Scribner Books editor-in-chief Nan Graham and authors Jackie Leiden and James McBride.
From WMRA Public Radio, a sponsor of the Virginia Festival of the Book. Welcome to the program this afternoon. Just for your information, you can find us in Charlottesville at 103.5 and in the Shenandoah Valley at 90.7. And on behalf of the Virginia Festival of the Book and the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, welcome. The festival is presented in a unique partnership between the Charlottesville-Albemarle community, business and civic groups, innumerable volunteers, and the staff and board of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. The involvement of the community, coupled with your enthusiastic participation, has made this event possible. Planning for next year's festival, which will be held March 22nd through the 26th, mark your calendar, is already underway. Both your financial contributions and your feedback are invaluable in our planning. Please help us by filling out the yellow program evaluation card that you were handed when you came in. Just return it to a volunteer as you leave. And it will take just a minute and enter you in the drawing for a signed festival poster. If you have any questions throughout the festival, I encourage you to stop by the information desk at the Omni. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's panel. Jennifer Ackerman's first book, Notes from the Shore, is a blend of memoir, natural history, and science. Her essays and articles have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, and other publications. She is currently working on a book about the genetic similarities between humans and other species, The Longest Thread. Jennifer?
Thank you. Welcome to the panel on Telling All, the Art of the Literary Memoir, which is really not about telling all at all. It's about not telling all, which we'll talk some more about later. I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists, and we'll talk for a while, and then we'll leave time at the end for questions. I'll start with Nan Graham. who's known these days as one of the country's 200 most influential women. Nan has been editor-in-chief of Scribner since 1994. Before that, she worked at Viking Penguin as executive editor and at Ballantine and Pantheon. Among the authors she has published are novelist Don DeLillo, Annie Proulx, Stephen King, John le Carré, as well as several authors of literary memoirs. Mary Carr, author of The Liars Club, the story of Carr's harrowing childhood in Texas. Mary Gordon, who wrote the forthcoming memoir, Seeing Through Places. Anne Truitt, author of Daybook, The Journal of an Artist. And Frank McCourt, whose memoir, Angela's Ashes, about growing up in extreme poverty in Ireland, has been on the New York Times bestseller list off and on for about 117 weeks. The sequel to Angela's Ashes, entitled Tis, will be out this fall. The voice of Jackie Leiden will be familiar to many of you. She's an award-winning senior correspondent for National Public Radio and often hosts Weekend Edition and All Things Considered. For 7 years, she has reported for National Public Radio on the Middle East, spending much of her time, as she says, in places that are farthest and strangest and hard, often on the front lines of war zones. She was part of the award-winning team that covered the Persian Gulf War, reporting from Baghdad, Beirut, Jerusalem, and Amman, Jordan. She says she's on Kosovo watch right now. Leiden is the author of the memoir Daughter of the Queen of Sheba, about growing up in a tension zone of a different kind in a family with a manic depressive mother. James McBride is a writer and a professional saxophone player and composer. He has composed music for Anita Baker and Grover Washington Jr. and has toured with jazz vocalist Jimmy Scott. A graduate of the Columbia University School of Journalism, McBride served as a staff writer for the Boston Globe, People magazine, and the Washington Post. His memoir, The Color of Water, a black man's tribute to his white mother, was on the New York Times bestseller list for more than a year. James is reading this afternoon at 4 at Barnes & Noble and signing copies there. I urge you all to come hear him read. Welcome to you all. To start, I'd like to go back to this title, Telling All title. I think literary memoir is not about telling all. I think that may be the job of a celebrity memoir, if anything. Literary memoir, it seems to me, is about finding a coherent story within a life, and that means carefully selecting what to tell and what not to tell, what to hold back, and about finding a voice with which to tell that story. There's been a real explosion in this form in the past few years. There's James and Jackie's books and Frank McCourt's book. And we've had Darkness Visible, William Styron's memoir of his bout with suicidal depression, Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen, The Liars Club, Kay Redfield Jamison's Unquiet Mind, Tobias Wolff's This Boy's Life, Caroline Knapp's Drinking, A Love Story, among many, many others. I'd like to start by asking you, Nan, as an editor with a global view and a special interest in memoir, what is it about memoir these days? Why are writers turning to this form, and why is there such a hunger for it?
I'm dying to know what the writers have to say about why they chose the form that they chose. It's a subject of endless sort of reflection, because it is astonishing how many memoirs there are. And in the beginning of this movement, there was a book called Stop Time by Frank Conroy, which, at least in my mind, was the first really modern memoir, and male. And subsequently, I feel as if there's a relationship between the loss of a kind of a narrative drive in fiction and the taking over of that kind of a narrative in nonfiction, not just memoir, but actually history. And at first I thought that there was something about the idea that we simply couldn't know everything anymore. There was just too much information out there, and so the best thing to do was simply to write about what you knew, which happened to be your own life. And I'm not really sure that that's what drove Jackie or James or anyone else. But the other thing that I think is interesting from the reader's point of view is that the reader really gets to see a character developed, gets to see the transformation of character, gets to see the beginning of identity. And that's something that I'm not sure that we get from a lot of the fiction that we're reading right now. So those are two ways of looking at it, either the writer's point of view or the reader's point of view. And I'm not sure either of them answers the question, but I'd love to hear what you know, whether you tried. I know Toby Wolfe actually tried to write fiction when he was writing this boy's story. And in fact tried to do so again on the second book, and it kept turning into a memoir. And I don't know whether either of you began that way. I suspect not, but whatever.
I'm pointing to James. James is pointing to me.
We're going to point at each other for a little while.
Yeah. Keep them in suspense. Well,
Go ahead.
when I started this, it's interesting that you mentioned This Boy's Life by Tobias Wolff and Stop Time by Frank Conroy, because it was, I think, around 1989 that I just had this passing idea that I might like to get this story down, because after all, I had spent my entire adult life chronicling other people's stories. And it dawned on me that I had this story within me that was going to escape from me if I didn't try to put it down on the page. And I realized that I didn't want that story to escape me. If you haven't read the book, this is a tale of my mother's mental illness, and basically it's how do you know that person you best think you know, your mother, if in fact she becomes someone else? Is that your mother in there or another creature? And as a reporter, I thought that maybe I would just do all of this as fiction. And this, again, was in the, I guess after the Gulf War, I resumed this thread, and I thought about it as something I would like to protect my family's privacy by doing it as fiction. And, it's interesting that and I looked at those two books because there weren't a lot of memoirs out at that time. I mean, this is the curse of the baby boomers, to think that you're doing something quite unique, and then you find that, 50 gazillion other people are doing the same thing. I mean, to my horror, everyone was doing a memoir. I mean, that's good maybe, but you don't feel as unique. And my mother and my grandmother, I mean, these real lives were just beating inside my head to get out as themselves. And the tale was more compelling that way. And so I decided that it really had to be nonfiction, but I still wanted to write about it as lyrically as it had been lived, and that became this memoir. James, your turn.
I want to say that. Well, I mean, I don't really... these are always difficult moments for me to discuss how I came to write the book, because the pat answer is that when I was 30 years old, I wanted to discover who I was, and I couldn't discover who I was until I discovered who my mother was, and I really didn't know, so I found out who she was, and I wrote a book about it, and that's basically what happened. I don't really care about the other memoirs that are being written, and I haven't read any of them. I mean, I don't mean to slight any other writer, really. I mean, I'm happy to be included in the surfeit of great writers and editors, my esteemed colleagues included, to include me as one of their pals and colleagues. But I don't really think that I'm a jazz person. I'm a composer and a saxophonist, and I grew up as a musician, and I always learned, and I worked as a journalist for many years. I worked at the Washington Post and the Boston Globe and so forth. I even worked at People magazine for a while. One of my more glorious. But, I always just went with what I had, I just never felt that you should swim against the tide. You just create with whatever comes to you. And so The Color of Water just grew out of this notion that this was just a unique story that I thought people would find interesting. And so I just wrote it in the best way I could. And then later on, I found out that, a lot of other people are writing memoirs and so forth, but I try not to. In fact, I don't pay a lot of attention to the industry at all. I read a lot of Spider-Man comic books, and I read The Incredible Hulk. They just started a new series. They started from comic book #1. And that's how I keep my voice. That's how I keep fresh. All the intellectual fluffery and duffery and puffery is bad for a writer, I think, and for any creative person. So that's how The Color of Water came to be a book. I was, you know, I just thought it was an interesting story, and I thought people would be interested. I thought that the story was bigger than myself or my mother, and I thought it was a story about humanity, and so that's what happened. It sort of like came out like that.
James, you said you found your voice in Spider-Man. One of the intriguing parts of your book is the alternating voices between your own voice and your mother's voice. And was it hard to find those two voices, or what was that process?
I mean, everybody knows their mother. I mean, you know, my mother's very. I mean, you know, I gave my mother a piece of fiction one time that I'd written, that I'd slaved over for a long time. Gave it to her, and I went away, and I came back, and I said, "Well, Ma, what do you think?" She said, "This sounds all made up." So it wasn't hard to sort of establish her voice because she just talks very directly, very straight. And it really wasn't my idea to write the book in alternate voices. Actually, the editor, Cindy Spiegel of Riverhead, was the one who... See, I wrote the book in Mommy's voice as the first person account of her life, and gave it to my editor, sort of like, you know, this is the book. And she said, this is very interesting, but it needs you in it, you know. So then I created alternate chapters, you know, when I found sort of parallel points in my life that sort of reflected my mother's life, and created chapter breaks based on that. So it wasn't really my idea to do the alternate chapters.
And Jackie, what about you in terms of finding voice? Was that a difficult process?
I'd say it was that the architecture, if you will, of the book, the notion of the voice, what to reveal, what to withhold, you know, how to draw her without overexposing her, that just took years. And it was the first book for me. I mean, I had written a lot, and I found that writing for the ear all those years of hashing it out at National Public Radio had really, as opposed to television, even though we're on television here, had really given me a chance to think about language. And so much of my mother's experience when she was delusional had to do with the fracturing and reinvention of language, appropriating it in strange and compelling ways, you know, sort of like hearing the Jabberwocky, Lewis Carroll's story, you know, read out loud. And I was so glad to have, to be able to build a vessel for that, and not to have to conform. Even at NPR, we have great latitude for our writing, and yet we still have deadlines and, you know, so many minutes and that sort of thing. And here I didn't have that. You know, I could just break away, and you'll understand this perfectly as someone who's been a reporter and then a more creative kind of writing. And her voice and my grandmother's voice and all these voices just, yeah, they just became, you know, like surf, very, very strong to listen to. But you still needed to build the right house for that in the architecture of the book.
Nan, do you have a story about Frank McCord's experience with sort of establishing his presence or voice?
Yeah, I think, well, when Jackie said it took her about 10 years to find, or a few years anyway, to find a voice, I think it took Frank about 40 years to find his voice, and it's a mighty good thing that he got around to it before he died. But he did say, because he and his brother had done a play called A Couple of Blaggards, in which some of the material of certainly their family appears. And I think since that, and he had always asked his students, he taught high school for 30 years in the New York City public school system, and always he taught creative writing, and he taught people to write about their home life. He tells very funny stories about, you know, telling them they would read Mimi Sheridan's restaurant reviews, and then he would ask them to review their mother's cooking, or their father's, as the case may be. Anyway, he said that he could not find the voice for the book. He could not figure out how to tell the story. And then he was spending the afternoon with his 4-year-old granddaughter, and he heard himself as a 4-year-old in her voice. And that was the beginning of the rest of the book. And all of these memoirs are, if you've read them, very differently structured. Both Jackie's and James's are very complex structures, at least I think, where you you go back and forth from a present voice to a past tense voice, and also around with other voices. And Frank's is very straightforward. He is a kid, and he tells his story purely chronologically. So he's 4, and then he's 5, and then he's, you know, he gets up to 19. But there isn't the complexity of structure, and voice is what makes that book so extraordinary. I know, I mean, I'm thinking about who I had more trouble with. And Mary Carr had much more trouble because she, too, needed to be able to be an adult commenting a little bit occasionally. And I think that sometimes really unnerves the writer and can unnerve the reader. But Frank, once he got it, got it.
One of the questions I'd like to ask both Jackie and James is about how you determined when subjective memory was enough and when you had to do some digging around, when you felt that you had to really try to track down facts either by consulting other family members or going places, and how did you determine which ground deserved which kind of treatment?
I always wanted to do that. I approached it like it was a news story, you know, and the good stories, the good magazine stuff. Well, I was a magazine writer too. I worked for I worked everywhere, man. But when I wrote long features, you know, the features that you didn't read to the very end, the ones that just were like long gray columns of pontification, were the stories that where the reporter sat down with a source or 2 sources and then just told that story. And so it sounds like this, and then I did this and that and the other, and then in '65, the war came, and and so after, you're fighting gravity. But the reporters who do a good job are the ones who go out and interview everyone, and I'm sure Jackie knows this as well and does this a lot in her work. The stories that have the details are the stories that work. And so what I would do is I would get from my mother, I would extract from her by whatever means necessary as much of a piece of that history as possible, and then I would go out and report around it so that I could fill her narrative with the small details that made it go. And in my own case as well, I would say, well, I'm going to write about this particular part of my life, and I'd go back and I'd interview relatives, my brothers and sisters, whoever knew me then, because most of the narrative in my book takes place, when it's in my voice, takes place between the ages of like 5 and 10, you know. I mean, I end at age 30, but most of my voice is that of a kid. And so so I just reported it until I just wrung the sponge dry, so to speak, in terms of reporting it. And then I just, I just trolled and figured out what jewels I needed. I mean, 90% of what I gathered I didn't use because I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I knew where I wanted my story and my book to fall. So I went out and I sort of just basically proved those points. So I did a lot of reporting around my subjects. I think a good book and a good story should do that.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Jackie?
Exactly the opposite approach. I had, and I realized this is the first time I've ever talked to, I think, another memoirist, and it's kind of interesting to hear how it's done. No, I think there is, it's like thumbprints, it's all so distinctive. Everyone is going to have a different one. I had a very different experience because I had cases and cases of diaries and hospital and court records and even some tape recordings that I had made. And why did I have all this stuff that I had started collecting at age 12 when she first became ill? And I sat down to write this book when I was, in my early 30s. Why? Not because I thought it'd be a glorious tome one day, but because I wanted to give it all to a judge so that when we got to the next commitment hearing, I would have my body of evidence. And so I had a lot of that. I certainly did talk to my siblings, but there weren't a lot of them to talk to. I mean, part of the problem in our family, or not the problem, but the dynamic in terms of my being the first witness for my mother and the first caretaker, and perhaps, in fact, reversing our roles a bit, was that, it was a small family. And I didn't want to... I wanted to bear witness through language, but not through the kind of construct that we do as journalists, because that was my everyday life. And as I had said earlier, this was a chance to do something else. If I felt that my memory served me badly, I would talk to one of my sisters, and I would get details fleshed out that way. I remember calling up one of the judges I don't know if you've read the book, but you know, it ends in a pretty dramatic scene with one of the judges who committed my mother. She's been through 2 commitments. She would just not like to recall that, but he was helpful. My grandmother had died, so, and it didn't seem hard, again, because all this stuff was rushing in. It was the winnowing out, not the going out to get, if you will. So,
James, you've talked a little bit about how the architecture of the book was shaped, and I'd like to ask both you and Jackie whether you consciously used the tools of a novelist in terms of creating a character persona for yourself and the other people in the book, also use of scene and plot. Did you rely on novelistic techniques or in your writing?
Well, I don't know what the hell that is, really. I mean, I don't even know what I'm doing. I mean, I always think that every word I write is the last word I'll ever write. I mean, I'm always amazed when I go to, talk to colleges and I hear these college professors talk about writing. I mean, these cats are just, they must write some dynamite books the way they talk about it. The character comes out, he puts his hat on, he's flush, he's full. I just sat down to write the story. I mean, I just did it like this. I said, I'm going to write a letter to a friend of mine, and this is what it's going to say. Hell with all that other crap. That stuff is just a bunch of, it's a way for colleges to collect tuition. Because, basically writing teaches writing. And you just go out and you just hit it as hard as you can, and for as long as you can, and if somebody reads it, and if it's really good, then they'll have all sorts of, I'm amazed that people extract all of these incredible things out of this book that I wrote, as I really don't see it, I think you have to, a friend of mine once told me, and I think he was right, he's a great musician, his name is Quincy Jones. I'm not name dropping, all right, and but when Quincy works, he says you have to get out of the way and let God into the room. That's what you have to do, when you do something creative. I just love that whole concept, because it's not really you that's doing it. You're getting out the way and you're letting the Lord work through you. And so that's what I just did. I just happened to be standing there with a handkerchief when God coughed.
Well, I wish he'd come over to my desk and sat down where he sat down at yours, because I was just sweating it out there by myself. All the torments of hell, remembering everything every creative writer instructor I ever had told me.
Thank you, Jackie.
So, just in case a few of you are employed in that field, I do remember hearing about Faulkner and Twain and all of them. And it really was a very different experience. It was conscious for me that I wanted to write this like a novelist, although I didn't know what that would be, and I think that's where some of these memoirs, Nan remarked about them having the same narrative drive. And I think it's true, when it's your life story, it better have a narrative drive. It's your story. And if you're not driving it, who is? And that's where you need to climb into the seat, and that's what takes time, that sense of self, which I gather you probably had at a pretty early age. But it took me a really long time to come there, because I'm probably as gullible as you are suspicious. So what I found is that I wanted texture, I wanted color, I wanted the sense of experience, I wanted the touch. I wanted not to talk to doctors. I didn't care what my mother's diagnosis was. It happens that it's bipolar mental illness. But I didn't know that, as a kid or a teenager or a young woman. I just knew that she was delusional. So I knew I didn't want anything like a how-to. One of the surprises, although I'm
really happy to own it, for me has been that the mental health community has embraced this book a lot, because there isn't a great, well, Girl Interrupted belies that. I was going to say there isn't a huge tradition of literature that deals with those themes in nonfiction, and now we're getting more into that. It's interesting. But I thought nobody has all the answers when they're going through this. And only a novelist has the sense of permission to free herself from the reportage. You know, I didn't have to say, on January the 25th at 10 o'clock in the morning, we saw Dr. So-and-so. I could just say, you know, that on a Wednesday morning when it rained, I noticed a purple flower and my mother had it in her hand, and then it became a crown. I wanted that sense of building the portrait. And
well, I want to respond since I'm, you know, since I'm so full of myself. And, I think I agree with everything that Jackie is saying. I just happen to think that that if you think about what you're doing too much, me personally, if I think about what I'm doing too much, I'll never do it. I mean, you know, it's like sex. I mean, if you just, you know, if you're taking notes and you're saying, well, you know, are you satisfied? No. Well, why don't we, I mean, you know, a good musician, a good jazz musician is someone who practices a whole lot. You know, the best jazz musicians are classically trained. And that was, you know, one of the jokes back in the 30s and 40s. And then, of course, her uncle was Charles Mingus. She doesn't really want everyone to know, but back in the 30s and 40s, you know, one of the reasons why a lot of the jazz musicians, you know, went to turn to drugs and so forth, because these guys were incredibly gifted classical players, mostly, or classically trained, who became these great jazz artists, and then, you know, didn't want to play dance music anymore, and so they got no work, and so they just sort of destroyed themselves. But the best musicians train themselves to the point when it's time to play, they forget their training, and they just go with instinct and gut. And if you're not good enough to go with instinct and gut, if you haven't trained enough, if you haven't read, you know, I read a lot of Spider-Man, but there was a time in my life where, you know, where Ralph Ellison was God to me. I mean, you know, I mean, Faulkner and all those cats, they're cool, but, I mean, if you read enough Toni Morrison, you don't need to read William Faulkner, really. I mean, if that's your cup of tea, read it. Don't raise your hand and say, I love Faulkner. Don't waste my time with that. I'm just saying. If you practice enough and you get your chops together, when it's time to do it, you can do it, and you have to forget what you did, so you can just go on instinct. You can see the lighthouse out there, and you can point your boat in a direction, and you can just go there. And if you can't, then you haven't practiced enough. You haven't been in the woodshed enough. That was what I was trying to say.
Well, I'm going to call Toni Morrison and ask her if she's read Faulkner. No, I think you're right, though, and I completely agree with James.
Yeah,
and
but
it's
see,
true.
Jackie, you're killing me with this. You know? This kind of intellectual fluffery puffery. I mean, what are we talking about here? I mean, we're just talking about a simple craft.
It's craft.
Whether it's Faulkner or, you know, or Spider-Man, it's just the craft of storytelling.
I think what I'm saying is actually not that diametrically opposed, in the sense that there are the experience has to be gut moving, but then the craft can take a long, long time to hone. And I think we're lucky. I think we worked really hard, and I think we're a little bit lucky, because for both of us, these are basically maiden voyages. And I think that James is absolutely right when he says you just have to let go. It's true.
Well, yeah, but I don't consider myself that lucky. I mean, no, I mean, listen, any black man who's 42 years old, and still living, it's not just luck. You have to be smart, and you have to be a little paranoid, you have to be a little bit clever, and you have to know how to live. I mean, you know, I love Frank McCourt. I'm so proud of him. I happen to have met him, and I think he's a fantastic person. But The Color of Water was released around the same time that Frank McCourt's book was released. And Frank McCourt's book was released as just a man who wrote a book about his mother. The Color of Water was a black man and was released in Black History Month and was reviewed with every other black book that came out. And that's just, and listen, I'm not faulting Frank McCourt. I mean, I'm delighted he took advantage of whatever, because he deserves everything he gets. But I think that, I mean, writing a bestseller is a matter of luck. But you also, there's a great deal of elbow grease involved.
There
And I
w-
think you would agree.
There were some people who really wanted to publish Angela's Ashes into St. Patrick's Day, James. He actually, I don't know what would have happened if you'd said no to Black History Month, but other people, including myself, were saying no to St. Patrick's Day, but Frank was saying no to St. Patrick's Day. It's a tendency of the universe as we know it to go for the,
I
the
agree.
known market.
I don't want to spin this off in that direction, but we were talking about luck and so forth. I mean, there's some luck.
Well, there's some luck, but also I do believe in making your luck. You make your luck.
That's right. You made your
Yeah.
luck.
When you've had a scrappy life. you know.
NPR is not an easy place to work.
Well, it's a piece of cake compared to my family. So, I think. No, I just think that where all these things, they are all points of departure from lives very hard-lived at very early ages. And I have, read your book and Frank's and mine and Mary Carr's, although I did not read hers. I did quit reading memoirs in about 1993 because I was so worried that I was going to be influenced by someone else's writing. And I decided that I would pick that up later. And these are all lives that, as kids, were so hard-lived. And I was thinking about this on the way down here. And I decided that, as children, we may have a greater sense of ourselves at that time, before you're 10, than you're going to again for the next 15, 20 years. Because the older you get, the more confused and less certain of yourself you get. It takes a long time to get that back, to get that really into your bones. And so I think that that kids can bear witness sometimes without any of the guile and complication that adults bring to the job. And I mean it when I say that I think that my family was harder terrain than my profession. It didn't fall into the same neat categories. I couldn't cut it up into 8 minutes. I couldn't turn it on at 5 o'clock, it's all things considered, and turn it off at 6 o'clock. For this evening, I'm Jackie Leiden. So it's a gift to be able to get it down. I don't know about you, but it's a gift to be able to get it down on the page and not have it get away from you. And that was a big, big desire for me. I didn't want to ever forget this character, my mother, as Sheba. When your mother dresses up in the bed sheets and places a tiara on her head and says, "I'm the Queen of Sheba, and I bequeath to each of my daughters a country, for you, Jackie, Mesopotamia," which is the ancient name of Iraq, and then 20 years later you find yourself, "Hey, I own Baghdad, and we don't need to worry about this because this is my country." You realize how important your childhoods actually are. So I don't know quite where I was taking that.
Well, what about the question of writing about family, some of which is still alive, and the issues of, am I hurting feelings? Am I violating privacy? What about my siblings who have their own stories to tell? And did those concerns give you trepidation, and how did you deal with it?
Well, yeah. Yeah, well, I have 11 brothers and sisters,
Got a lot of stories.
Well, I'm sick of them, man. I hate them, No, we're very close. My family's very close. And so I was concerned about how my brothers and sisters would be perceived and presented and so forth. I tried to be as honest to the truth as I knew it. And a couple of them were kind of pissed off at me, I have one sister, my sister Kathy, every time you mention the book, her eyes roll up into her head and go down through Mississippi, come up to Georgia, before they finally, right themselves. And I have a brother who, who's told me, he said, "Why don't you just give out my credit card number too? It's, it's 45769, But I told him, I said, with a $300 credit limit, it's not like, No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. But most of them are proud of the book. I mean, they're all proud of it on some level. I think they're, they're very private people. We were very poor when we grew up, and I think a lot of them didn't want people to know that. It's just we were very private, So some of them were a little bruised by it. But they see it as a book that's really about Mommy, about our mother, and they're very proud of what she's done, and so they can take that, you know. So that it's been okay. I think a couple of my Jewish relatives were not pleased, but I changed all their names, so you know, they remain anonymous.
Are they not pleased because they wanted to get famous in the book, or
No,
they wanted
well,
their real names
They
in
didn't
there?
like how they were famous.
Well, no, I mean the book isn't an attack on them. It's just, you know, it's just the story of my mother's life. I mean, it's some of the revelations about their behavior was not flattering. But this was 50 years ago. I mean, and it wasn't an attack on them by any means. And I just, you know, some of them just didn't feel comfortable. And there were some who just didn't want people to know their relatives were black, you know. And that's okay too. I mean, but most of them that I have met, it's been great. You know, I have a first cousin from Dallas. You know, I met him at the Newark airport. You know, and I was standing there. I didn't know what he looked like. You know, and I just stood there with my hand out, trying to shake the hand of every short Jewish guy that you know walked past. But it's been largely a pretty delightful experience.
Well, I was at Yaddo the summer, I think it was 1994, 95, I guess, and I had just gotten the book contract several months prior, and I got a call from my agent who said, "Jackie, it's Gail Hockman here, you got to call me back right away." And I thought, I couldn't imagine what piece of great news she had for me. And she said, "Your mom called up Houghton Mifflin today and threatened to sue their asses off if you write another word about her." And this is absolutely true. And I called my mother back, and I didn't know how I was going to handle this. I couldn't believe it. I had been home the week before, and she had been thrilled about a testament to her to her very difficult life and to the many, many journeys she'd taken inside. And I said, "Did you really do this? You know, someone called the publisher today, and they used some kind of rough language and threatened to sue them." And she said, and I said, "They were impersonating you," because I, you know, approached my mother very delicately at times. And she said, "That was no impersonator, that was me. And I'm going to sue them if you write another word about me." And in the end, she signed a release and went with this because she wanted, that'd be fascinated, you know, because it sounds good to draw your mother out. And I think it must be so difficult for these women. I mean, we really have. We've used the stuff of their lives here. But my mother also wanted to have had, all, you know, she's been in the hospital 22 times in different mental hospitals. And our lives, the seasons, were really demarcated by her spells, and you would never know when she went into one, if she would come out the other side or when. And I think she wanted that life not to have been lived for nothing, and that was why she agreed to the book. When I first showed her the galleys, I'd given it to her I'd forgotten that I had, and I called home several weeks later. It was my birthday, and she said, "I'm reading that book, Jackie, 350 pages of vicious lies." And I said, "Oh my gosh, how can you say that?" And she said, "Well, it says right here on page 11 that I had an acid party at my house." And I knew I hadn't written any such thing, since nothing remotely like that had ever happened. And I looked in and it said, "It was the Mad Hatter's tea party, and I had swallowed the Red Queen's dram. It was a house on acid." I said, "Mom, that's a metaphor." And she said, "What's that?" And I thought, how are we going to make it through this? My mother hasn't read a book since high school. So now she has come to really love this book. It means something to her. I mean, I did want to protect her privacy. I changed her name. I changed the name of my hometown. But it's all known now. I mean, the Milwaukee Journal, you know, is written about us both. We're from Wisconsin. We were on Oprah together, you know, 6 months later. Talk about a surreal experience. Between your mom and Oprah on national TV. Not like the little town hall meeting we're having here. So she had come a long way. And now my mother, she has come to readings with me, and she quite likes it, and she will sign the book for you, and it will say, "Thank you for sharing a little bit of my life, Sheba." And I consider that one of the biggest journeys we've taken together.
James, you did encounter some real resistance from your mother in unfolding her story, and to the point where really she was just blocking you at points. And how did you push through that?
How did I push through that? Well, I told Mom the book would make me $1 million. That moved the mountain a lot. And other than that, I was just persistent. You know, I would find her. What I would do is I would find mementos from her past, pictures. Like I went to Suffolk, Virginia, which is, I guess it's near here, right? A couple hours away. And I found a childhood friend of hers had a picture of her when she was 8. And I took it and showed it to Mommy, you know, and that just, it blew her mind. But after a couple of days, you know, she started to talk about it. It wasn't like, you know, it didn't burst forth. It just, it came slowly. And after a while, it became kind of a catharsis for her to talk about all these mysterious, these secrets that she'd held in her bosom for so long. And it particularly with regard to her mother. She was very guilty about abandoning her mother and leaving her behind with her tyrannical and, you know, mean father. So it felt good for her to be able to talk about that and to kind of get it out. And, you know, I don't think Mommy really realized she's, you know, Mommy's a very smart person, but she's not really media savvy, you know? I mean, she didn't really realize what she was doing on some levels. I mean, she knew that I was writing a book and she was, you know, hip to it, but she didn't realize that, you know, that it would one day be discussed on C-SPAN, you know, or whatever, you know? I mean, and she doesn't really care now that it's out, you know? She doesn't really care that much about it. You know, she's happy that the book has inspired, you know, poor people, particularly, poor blacks particularly, because she lived in that world, and that's the world that accepted her. And any single parent, she's very empathetic toward people who don't have money because she was so poor for so long. So she's happy that the book is read by people who don't have money, who have lots of kids, and, you know, she's happy about that. So, I mean, it was tough for her when she first read the manuscript. You know, she stayed in her room for a couple days and didn't come out, you know.
Did you change anything? Did she ask any, or did anyone in the family?
She did not ask me to change a thing. After she read it, you know, I asked my sister what was going on, because she lives with my sister. And I'd call, I'd say, what's going on? My sister would say, Kathy would say, she's still in the room. She hasn't come out. You know. But, you know, I'll call you back later. But when she finally came out, she just said, it's all right. You know, it's all true. Because she didn't even want to change the names, you know, of some of her relatives. And I said, no, Ma, you know, we don't even know where these people are. It's 50 years ago, you know, she didn't care. She was a little bit scared that her father might be alive. I mean, he's long. I mean, he was angel dust by the time that, you know. But she didn't contest any of she didn't contest anything I wrote. You know, once in a while she'd correct certain things about Judaism that I didn't know. You know, she'd say it was the Torah, it wasn't the Bible, you know. It was in Hebrew, not, you know, not Yiddish, you know, like that.
Jackie, did you get that kind of, either from your mother or from your siblings especially?
My siblings, my sisters, were incredibly supportive, although they're very, very different from each other. I mean, you know, one of them is a bodybuilder and tattooed and drives a school bus and, you know, communes with the spirits, and the other one is a lawyer. And so and the fact that they both liked it and do like it meant a lot. But, you know, my mother likes it now, and that means a great deal to me. And it's sort of what James was saying about his mother and feeling that this had a resonance for people who were, you know, disempowered in various ways. Well, it's the same thing, certainly, for people who have had difficulty with their brains, with any kind of brain dysfunction. People who were, now we think of diagnosis in terms of mental illness as a fairly easy thing to obtain, but that's just, you know, within the last few years. And so my mother really particularly likes, if I speak to a mental health group, and she's come to some of those with me, and, you know, she's listened as I've read. And she's done something wonderful for me. She's made it very clear that this is my book, you know, that my memories may not agree with her memories, and that that's okay, that, you know, if she were to write a book, it would, of course, be different. And she's allowed me to have this experience, and I cannot imagine what it would be like to have a family member, because we are a really bonded family, how I could possibly live with myself if she hadn't liked this book. I mean, I couldn't, you know, I mean, I wouldn't be here. And same thing with my sisters. Because I've heard about writers who say, I'm just going to do that. Of course, you've got 12 people. That's a lot to contend with, you know. And not everyone has to love it, but I didn't want anybody who really disliked it in a profound way, you know, had a gut negative reaction. And even my father, who I write about in here, his comment was, well, I'm just too close to say anything about it, so I won't say anything about it. And I thought that's fair enough, you know.
But how many people? You have three, and you have two siblings, right? So it was three of you?
That I write about in this book.
Oh, okay. Well, see, I just want to point out that I didn't tell most of my brothers and sisters I was writing this book. Because in a family of 12, there's no democracy, you know. So I just, to hell with them, they'll read it like everybody else. And so I did it that way. And I think they were stunned
I bet
when
they
when they started. But that's the only way I could have got it done. I wouldn't have been able to write it any other way. It would have been a discussion, you know, Easter, Christmas,
Oh, yeah.
oh, you know, it would have never gotten done. It would have never gotten finished.
I didn't let them read it. I just,
But they knew that you were doing it.
They did know, yeah.
Well, Frank McCourt's brothers, Malachi McCourt's response was to write his own book.
Yep, Malachi, and then now there's another one coming down the pike. No, Alfie, you'll be hearing from Alfie soon. Yeah. But Frank did tell me that he had a long conversation with Malachi. For those of you who've read the book, there's a moment when the mother is, when Angela is sleeping with her cousin and climbs up the ladder to the sleeping loft. And it was obviously an incredibly difficult period for her and for the kids. And Frank said that he talked to Malachi about whether to leave that scene in or not to leave it in, because it's not as if Angela would like anything about this book. Frank has made it abundantly clear that it would be impossible to have published it if she hadn't died. But Malachi is the one who said, no, you know, you can't leave that out. That was formative. And I think that's the only really critical scene in the book that about which he had a doubt. And Malachi, who's not perfect in every way, was clearly the right voice at that moment. And he is a storyteller. There are different kinds of storytellers. One of the things about the experience of publishing this that struck me the most is we have a cousin, Jennifer and I, who runs child welfare programs in the state of Vermont. And she said after reading this book that it had changed the way she was doing her job, because she would have taken these kids away from their parents. It was such a bad, it was in her mind, according to the measures of child welfare and, you know, the child welfare board in Vermont, not a good family for a kid to be in. And what she realized is that it may have been a really bad family in some ways, but something came out of it for these kids, including the role of storytelling itself as a redemptive thing, as a way of saving oneself, finding and saving oneself. And that, in a way, that made me, it just flipped my entire thinking about the role of memoir and this story in particular. And I presume that if we were all in Vermont, we'd be seeing some difference in the child welfare programs.
It does seem that several of the memoirs that are emerging are memoirs, stories that really stand in for a group in some way. They are representative of some kind of universal for some group of people. I want to ask you, Nan, what is it you look for in a memoir? How did you develop a special interest in publishing memoir, and when they come in, what do you look for? And has there been a flood lately of manuscripts that are memoirs?
Well, there was actually a flood after the Liars Club. So when Frank McCourt came in, he was the first person that I broke down on, having sort of rejected a lot of them along the way. On an earlier panel today, someone was a filmmaker was talking about the three parts of literature that are important: theme and character and plot. And voice is what's, at least in my mind, the most important piece of a memoir. The territory is can be of immense interest: mental illness, poverty, black-white issues, religion, incest. But it is it's the voice. Obviously, there are a lot of stories even in this room that might be as remarkable in some ways as Jackie's or James's, but it is the voice that tells them that is so completely compelling. And that is it. You either get that voice or you don't get that voice, and then you can, the process of editing once you have the voice is only about. The first memoir that I ever published came in 600 pages long and ended up being 224 pages long, and that was really just about finding the thread. The voice was there. It was just about what actually served the story and what didn't, and it was just a matter of trimming it and trimming it and trimming it. And in Frank's case, there really was almost, I confess, that other than the fact that Angela was once pregnant for 18 months in an earlier draft of this book, there was really nothing that I had to do. It's just kind of a miscarriage that went, you know, we forgot about it somewhere in there. And Mary Carr needed needed an enormous amount of guidance and help, because I think part of the, I mean, I think you've assembled, Jennifer, the two bravest memoirs on the face of the earth. It's a very, it can be a very scary journey because you are going to a place of immense, often, vulnerability and pain, and sometimes you literally just want someone holding your hand through that particular darkness, and that was certainly the case with Mary. And I keep thinking about Catherine Harrison's memoir, The Kiss, in the context of this, you know, what do you do when you're really telling a story that the family can't abide in any way? And it is an extraordinarily lonely experience. So you were lucky to get your siblings along with you, and I guess, you could have 5 with you and 5 without you, and you'd still be rich.
Well, no, I mean, you know, no matter what I did, I knew they would, you know, they would love me, you know. So I mean, and although you know, Jackie and I have, you know, we're very brave people, and you know, the fact is that I'm sure Jackie feels this way. I can tell, you know, by her spunk, that she has that invulnerability that comes with just telling what it is, you know, telling it all. It's like, you know, you were ashamed of your mother because she was white. So, I mean, you know, what, didn't you, I mean, she broke every rule. So what? You know, I'm still here, I'm still living, man, my heart's still pumping. You know, I might smoke a cigarette after this is all, I don't care. The point is, I mean, you know, we're living, and, you know, we're here to enjoy what's here. And if we did things that were bad, you know, I was talking to someone earlier today about when I was in high school. I was terrible, man. I was an awful kid, you know, in high school. And you know, I mean, but I'm okay now, and you know, I mean, my sins are forgiven, and you know, we're here. So and so there's a certain invulnerability that comes with, you know, just telling all and telling it like it really was, as opposed to how you wanted it to be.
It would be a very bad book if you did that. It wouldn't be a memoir. It would be a fable, for one thing. You know, Jackie's and James's fables. I felt like in Daughter of the Queen of Sheba that, in fact, in the reader's guide that's in the paperback edition, you know, I haven't really had this conversation with her, but it sometimes would, and it's so unfair. I don't know why I made this woman, you know, stand in for this, but I would ask you know, NPR, I have grown up with it. I've been there 18 years. And I remember it would flash through my mind on occasion as I was writing in Toronto, where I wrote most of the book and finished it up in Ireland. What would Nina Totenberg think? You know, why I made it Nina, I have no idea. She sits across from me now, and I don't know if she's even seen that in the reader's guide. And I remember that I thought to myself, if I have to worry about what my colleagues think or what the listeners are going to think later, or what my family, you know, I mean, my family I was the most worried about, certainly what my friends are going to think. You know, I thought, it doesn't matter. You just have to be true to this story, and you will sort all that other stuff out, or won't, later. And maybe that does kind of come with you when you've already dared so much, and, you know, ultimately you're responsible for yourself and your loved ones.
Well, in my case, you know, I spent most of my life seeing my mother be abused for being poor and having all these black kids, and she just ignored it. She just kept her eye focused on what the prize was. And so I learned early on in life to focus on whatever I needed to do and to ignore whatever didn't work. The other thing that was that I think people who write memoirs, I mean, now that we're, you know, fluffing in that direction, people who write memoirs, or people who have a sense of humor, tend to tell good stories. I mean, if you ever hear Frank, I mean, if you have never heard Frank or Malachi read, you are missing. I mean, it's better than the movies. I mean, they are so funny. And they you know, they have this tragic life, but yet they're so their sense of humor has, has sort of just propelled them through it. I mean, people who come from tragedy, if they come from sad circumstances, if they have the ability to laugh, often are the best storytellers. And they tell these stories in a way that are painless. And I think that's a mark of a good, probably a good memoir, certainly a mark of a good story.
Yeah, when Mary Carr actually sent in 80 pages of the Liars Club initially, and that's what the people who wanted to publish it bid on. But she also wrote a letter, and it was really about the fact that most memoirs before this had either been about being a victim, women's memoirs in particular, Mary McCarthy, Maya Angelou. It was either about being a victim or it was about idealizing a life, and that she was very intent on getting to a place where it wasn't about being a victim, it wasn't about a perfect life. She really just told it as she knew it or saw it. And I think that we now take that absolutely for granted, that that's the way all memoirists, if there's now a whole sort of, I feel as if there's a tribe of memoirists that we've now, and they're running around here and we identify more of them every day. But I think we actually do, something has actually shifted in the kind of memoir that's being written in the last 10 years, and you're all contributing to it. But there weren't so many when Mary, 8 years ago, had written 80 pages of the Liars Club.
Well, I have a question that I'd like my three esteemed colleagues to sort of address. I mean, is it just me, or is it like these memoirs that come out, every Thursday saying, I didn't wash my drawers, my socks, they weren't in the third drawer, I got really pissed off, I beat my brother up, I was a prostitute when I was 14, and 15 I smoked dope, and then 16 I was a dope smoker and a prostitute, and 17 I was a dope smoker, prostitute, and I stole bicycles, and I don't get it. Those stories don't sound that interesting to me. And I don't mean to belittle anybody's experience, but is it just me?
No, it's not just you. And I'll tell you something quite honestly. There are memoirs I wouldn't want to be on the same panel with. I don't think they're all of a class. And I'm not going to say who I feel like that about, because I feel everybody's book is their own reality, and I wouldn't want, they're free to publish it, and other people are free to read it. But I think that that the idea of a confessional and a pity me is absolutely anathema to me. I wouldn't want to read that. I certainly wouldn't want to write it. And I think that the best stories, the best narratives will work just like fiction does, in the sense that there'll be compelling characters, there'll be a resolution, because a confessional to me is the unthought about life, just a kind of regurgitation of what happened, whereas the book that has muscle and sinew and heart is the one that's, you've exercised through it, and you've literally knitted yourself together, and that's why you're doing this. I mean, people who ask me, was this a catharsis for you? I mean, I like it that you said it was for your mother, and I think it's becoming a little bit more like that for my mother. I thought catharsis is what, I have done in what I do in therapy. This is writing. This is different, This I have a different kind of respect for. So... And I certainly wanted to be as courageous as I found my mother who would be. She was writing legal briefs challenging everybody who was suing her, everybody who wanted to haul her into the hospital or prison. And I don't have much patience for those books that have even a bit of self-pity.
Well, we concur on that, and also I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why I don't like those kinds of books, because they are self-reflections. The people buy those books because they reflect, they hope to see something in those books that is a reflection of them. And is that what a book is supposed to do? Is it supposed to reflect what you are and what you've experienced, or is it supposed to take you to new territory and take you somewhere? A lot of us in this room, I'm sure, have smoked many a joint. And a lot of people in this room have done many things that they are ashamed of and they didn't want anybody to know about. And so if it's in someone else's book, is it going to make you a better or a bigger person? Or if you've been in the situation where someone who has, someone who's mentally ill, for example, and you read Jackie's book, and you are sort of, this opens you up to something that you never thought about. I think that's what a book is supposed to do. It's supposed to open you up to something.
Am I allowed to ask one question of the two writers, since I never get to ask questions of writers who aren't writing? So one of the questions about, at least in my mind, for people whose first books are memoirs, is what then what happens next? Do you then become a novelist? Do you write a piece of nonfiction? Is this the only book that you write? What do you, once you've actually figured out how to do the book and you've been through the incredible torment of finishing it, then do you have an impulse to go on? And if so, in what language or in what form or...
Well, that's a really good question, and my publisher would kill me if I asked if we could talk later. So, no, I think it's a really, really good question. And so I'm not going to say that I actually said that. I feel that I don't know, but I'm really curious to see how you'll answer this. I'm sure it's not the only story you want to tell. It became the first story. You know, it became the story that pushed other things I wanted to talk about aside. And I'm very keen to keep writing. And I'm a little bit torn between working on nonfiction and fiction, and I decided I really want to push for this novel that I've been thinking about for a long time. And it's interesting, its characters are beginning to fill in and thrash around and be as noisy as the real-life characters I heard from before. And I was talking to someone very dear to me about feeling very torn about writing this nonfiction book, which would be about a country I have covered a great deal, which everyone is beginning to write about, or the novel. And he said, well, Jackie, if you go out and do the nonfiction, you've done that, you know, you've done a lot of reportage. You haven't really totally seen what you can do with this and delved in. And I know there's just so many stories that now feel like they are demanding to be told. And I know myself as a journalist. I want to keep getting to know myself as this kind of writer. I don't know what James is thinking.
Well, I mean, I definitely am going in a different direction. I don't think I'll ever write about myself again.
Oh, I'm not going to write about myself.
Oh,
no.
okay. Well, I don't think I'll ever write any other Colors of Waters or anything like that, like Color of, Mud Part 2. I mean, I kind of want to get out of the whole...
Granddaughter of the Queen of Sheba.
Right. The color of the granddaughter of the Queen of Sheba. I'm done with all that. Right now, I would like to get back to music a little bit to just, to blow it out, I'm writing Quincy Jones's autobiography. And that's something that came as a result. I met him I was doing a workshop at Walt Disney, in California, of a musical that I wrote called Bobo's. It's about a 13-year-old boy who wants an expensive pair of tennis shoes. It's a Broadway show I was working on, and it was gathering steam. And I was one of 4 composers that was selected out of hundreds to workshop my piece at Disney. And Quincy was one of the panelists that Disney brought in to evaluate my work. And he had just read The Color of Water, which had just come out. And so after this performance, he came up to me and he said, I love, and the actors blew it, man, when they saw Quincy Jones there. They just like, oh, man. He was in the first row, and instead of singing their lines, they just go like, then they do like Luther Vandross. I got the and so it was horrible. It came out, it was terrible. And I was leaving the room. I was sitting behind I'd played and I just gathered my music, I gathered my score, and I was walking out. And Quincy just broke away from these people who and he said, I want to talk to you. He said, it was fantastic. He said, I heard beyond all that stuff. I thought it was great. So I read your book. He said, Alex Haley was working on my autobiography, and he died. And do you want to do it? Oh. So I said, well, actually, I said, I don't know. Because he said he travels a lot. And, I have kids, and I traveled for years as a musician, and I didn't want to do that traveling thing. So I went home and told my wife what I told Quincy Jones. And she flipped, man. So then I called him up, and he didn't call me back for several months. Mm-hmm. And then one day, he called, and so that's what I'm doing now. But I'm not doing any more nonfiction after this. Is the last life that I'm not purging any more souls after this. After this, it's all fiction, musicals, that's it. It's too hard.
But Frank McCourt has lived longer than we have, and so he presumably may have.
I have it.
Yes.
I'm in possession of the new book.
The vault.
I think we can probably take a few questions now. I will ask that whoever would like to ask a question, please step up to the microphone if you can make it. I know people are sitting in the aisles.
That looks harder than usual.
Yeah, but there's been a strong demand for speaker at the microphone, please. So if anybody has any questions.
We can repeat the question if you're really daunted by getting to a
We
microphone.
can certainly do that. Yes.
Mr. McBride, how is your mother?
She asked how your mother is. James.
She's fine.
No,
She's
they
fine.
have to.
She lives outside of Trenton, New Jersey. She's 70. I'm not supposed to tell anybody.
Yeah, boy, I was going to say. I say they don't mind if you write books about them, but tell their age and they'll crack
That's
you in
it.
the head.
That's right. Yeah. She's doing fine. She had open heart surgery last year, quadruple bypass, and a valve replacement. She came out fine. She's doing well. You know, she's doing great.
Yes. We really do want you to try to make it to the microphone if you can. There's one behind you. You can use the one behind you. Go ahead.
Reach this microphone. How long did each of you work on the book before you found a publisher, and how long after you found a publisher?
Sometimes I feel like I just don't remember. I mean, a long time. I started thinking about it at the end of the 80s. I started writing it in a back garden in London. I was working on it at the Al Rashid Hotel in Baghdad, and then I put it aside for a long time. It was several years before, and took a long time to get good pages, and then got a contract, and the last two-thirds of it came much more quickly.
About that, I've had probably the same experience. I mean, I started the book in 1982. You know, I wrote a magazine piece while I was at the Boston Globe. You know, I quit to write the book, ended up going to Africa and fooling around, you know, and never really, you know, it just, after I got the contract, I started to really, you know. So I can't say, you know, I usually say it took about 14 years, but that was like 3 or 4 years ago. It was 14 years. I don't really remember. It took several years. And then after I got the contract, I was working as a saxophonist for a guy named Little Jimmy Scott. And I was writing songs for Anita Baker and so forth. So I was traveling a lot, and I wrote a lot of the book in hotels and on vans and in buses and stuff. You know, I tend to do a lot of good writing that way. So, you know, it took years.
Yes. It's coming.
Thankless task.
Okay. Okay. I was wondering what it is that got you to the point where you knew you wanted to write about your life and your family's life. I mean, obviously these are things that had moved you for a long time. What is it, and where did you get to the point that you said, okay, I'm going to do a memoir, I'm going to write a book about this?
That one I can answer pretty easily. I had been fooling around with this and sort of drawing some scenes before I covered the Gulf War, and then about a year and a half after, I was interviewing a Palestinian family leaving Kuwait on the Kuwaiti-Iraqi border, and the head of household was saying to me, you know, that this family, he said, we are not going to lose all our stories, you know, we're being kicked out of here, we've been here for 3 generations. And it just dawned on me, just in a flash, that if I didn't get this Sheba down, I was going to lose my family history, just like all these exiles I had written about for years. Not just people in the Middle East, but, you know, American farmers who had lost their farms, steel workers who had lost their way of life. Patco, I remember covering the air traffic controller strike and thinking, you know, where are those guys now? So many people who had lost everything that was about their identity. And there was a line I wanted that I didn't use in this book because another writer had wanted to use it for her book, but I thought about it a lot. It's by James Baldwin. And he says, identity is the end of safety. And I thought that is really true, and I want to cross over to that. And it just took time to have enough identity, but that was a real crystallization moment for me.
For me, I mentioned earlier that I reached the point in my life when I was about 30 where I needed to figure out who I was, and I couldn't do that until I figured out who my mother was. But also, I felt a certain debt to the community that I grew up in. You know, I grew up in so-called quote-unquote black America, and I was always, I was and continue to be very disturbed at the image of black America that exists in America. You know, we are constantly portrayed as savages and drags on society, and that's all. You know, there's no humanization of black people. It's either O.J. Simpson or, you know, Clarence Thomas. I mean, you can't be a shy, withdrawn person who, you know, who just likes race cars and likes Lionel trains and just goes home and plays with them all day. There's no room in society for that image of what a black person is. And so I felt, and still feel, a great deal of empathy and sympathy toward a community that I see has a lot of love in it. And it gave my family and my mother a tremendous amount of love, particularly from the church. And so I felt that, you know, we're not all like the Jeffersons, you know, living on the East Side, good time. And neither are we like, you know, the stereotypical images of what blacks are on and it's portrayed on television and in literature. Black people are just a range. They represent a tremendous range of emotions and people in a community where kindness and trust is what really represents us more than anything else. That's why blacks are so abused. And that's why they're so trusting, because they trust anybody, they follow anybody, and they get abused a lot. Most poor people in most neighborhoods in most countries have this problem. They're trusting, they're open, and they're abused, and then they're misrepresented. And I felt, and I still feel very strongly, that The Color of Water should and does represent a certain part of black America that most people only see from behind the wheel of a tightly locked car. And so that's one of the main reasons, one of the impetuses in writing this book.
Anybody else?
Actually,
Yes.
stepping up to the microphone. My question is for Ms. Graham. You mentioned Katherine Harrison's book, The Kiss, which is the memoir of her incestuous relationship with her father, which began in her college years. And I also have her novel, Thicker Than Water, which was essentially the same story. I have sort of a marketing-oriented question, which I won't bore you with first. I'll bore you with it second. The first question is, why write a novel first and a memoir next, and revisit the same stuff? And as a publisher, in general, how do you feel about sort of the evolution of that kind of story? I mean, I'm interested why it would be published twice, essentially. And second, it came along when memoirs are making such a big splash in general, and of course there's controversy and there's interest because of the nature of that story. What's the next big thing after memoir, do you see, from sort of, that's the boring marketing thing I snuck it in?
Poetry. You know, I really don't know the answer to that question. I wish I knew the answer to that question, because I could, I'd get credit for seeing into the future. I don't think that we're finished with memoir. And to go back a little bit to the Katherine Harrison question, I didn't edit either of those books, although I read them both very early on in their lives as books. And I think the material was extremely compelling, and if she... I mean, obviously, it would be better if Katherine were answering this question. Katherine wasn't ready to write it as a memoir when she was 25 years old, and essentially had to write it as a memoir when she was 33 years old.
That's an interesting perspective.
And she, as you probably know, and as everyone else in the room probably knows, got into a huge amount of trouble and was accused of being a bad mother, and how could she do this to her children, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I think what she said at the time was, this was the moment when I could do it. And you do have to seize the moment. I mean, obviously, there's a moment, even though you were compelled by your mother's story for a long time, there was a moment at which it takes over, and that becomes what you do. And I certainly think that was the case in The Kiss. And then, you know, in defense of her as a mother, that I think it's probably better if you write the story when your kids are 6 and 7 than when they're 14. And they were going to find out. And I've always thought that the secrets in a family are more damaging than the truth in a family. That is where you really do destructive work, is by not telling. So, and why it would be published again? Because it is a completely different book. And if I had had the opportunity to publish it, I would have. And I really do wish I had the answer to the future. I think we're going to have memoirs for a good chunk of time. And then perhaps we'll go back to, I mean, I think what I said earlier in the afternoon about narrative, and it's sort of, at least in my mind, it's being drawn out of fiction to some degree, consciously on the part of the writer or not. But when you look at things like books like Into Thin Air or Undaunted Courage, there is a way, or No Ordinary Time. There is definitely a kind of nonfiction that is that is not memoir either, that has become as popular as fiction used to be in the olden days. The nonfiction bestseller list is not so much celebrity autobiography anymore. It really is compelling narrative history, and we haven't had that for 20 years, not since sort of the days of, I don't know, William Manchester or something. So maybe we'll be having more of that.
Thank you. And as the baby boomer generation ages, maybe it'll be memoirs about aging.
Let's not go back to the subject of dementia, okay?
Any other questions? Yes.
I don't know why I should be surprised when I heard James McBride mention Black History Month, because we Jews were very much captivated by the idea of the book, and it was of great interest. And I wondered what feedback you got from Jewish groups on this.
Oh, baby.
How much time do you have, right?
Well, I mean, you're right. How much time do you have? No, there was a tremendous surge. The Color of Water is a bestseller because of Jewish readers, basically. I mean, it was a book that was embraced by the Jewish community. Very few black people read The Color of Water when it first came out. I mean, I would do readings, and the entire audience would be young Jewish women aged, 40 to 80. I mean, when the book first came out, I was desperately trying to sell it, so I was doing like coffee classes. I was like Bob Dole, man. I'd bring my saxophone and play, and they'd cook bagels and lox and gefilte fish. I mean, fed me I looked like Rush. What's the fat? Rush Limbaugh. Man, I was fat as a pig after. But no, basically the Jewish community. I mean, there have been some Jewish people who feel that the book is anti-Semitic because of the betrayal of my grandfather. But, and the fact is that just because someone's Jewish doesn't qualify them to tell me how to write about my own family, not to mention the fact that you have to be honest to history. If I said my grandfather was like this great guy who was really misunderstood and so forth, I'd be an apologist. I'd be no better than people who write books to say the Holocaust never happened. And I've been proud to accept my own Jewish history, and I've been proud to meet and honored to meet so many people Jewish people who love the book. I mean, there are always one or two creeps, and that's for every group. But by and large, the book has largely been embraced by the Jewish community, not so much by the black community until like the last, 6 or 7 months. When it came out in paperback, here come the black folks. But it took a long time before the book was embraced by black people. But Jewish people, certainly Jewish women, and a lot of white women in general, especially women with children, embraced the book.
Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much. their books are, and I should take their show on the road. I know. They haven't met? No, this is the first meeting. And it's these guys out for the, the books coming out at the same time. Sending out together. Great potential there in the Come on up there.
When you talk about the voice is the most compelling, and I'm sure you come out with a writer's voice, so you've gone through all this stuff, and this is what your voice says on stage.
You just watched a C-SPAN special presentation of Book TV, regularly seen on our companion network, C-SPAN 2. As well as live programming, Book TV